All right, I think we're recording. Welcome back to Gamecool Books. This will be for episode 9. I'm joined this time by Gabriel Schenk, who's a preceptor at Signum University. And Gabriel, you're speaking to me from Oxford in the UK.
I am, yes, from a cold November night.
Yeah.
And for any listeners who can see the webcam view, you can also see my companion Pandora, who I sometimes think of as my demon.
That is excellent. My demons are around here somewhere. I've got 3 of them. We'll see if they make an appearance. So how did you arrive at Oxford? Can you tell us also, how did you come to Philip Pullman's work and the Golden Compass in particular?
Well, I lived near Oxford. I've lived near Oxford all my life. I used to live in Cumnor, where Philip Pullman now lives, and now I live in a village just a few miles away from Cumnor. But both Cumnor and the village I'm currently in, Ensham, are just a few miles out of the city centre. So I'm really an Oxford man / country man, I suppose. And I discovered Pullman. I can't remember exactly when it was. I mean, my edition of Northern Lights is this one. It's not the first edition, unfortunately. It's I think a 1996 edition, by which time Pullman had already won the Carnegie Medal. And I remember, I think my parents bought me this or something because they heard that it was set in Oxford or something. And I remember looking at the cover and thinking it didn't look terribly interesting because I'm not that interested in bears. And I thought it was probably a book all about bears. But then I picked it up one day and I read it and I absolutely loved it. And then by the time the Amber Spyglass came out, I was a proper fan. And I got one of my friends into the series as well. And he scored some tickets to see Philip Pullman live, which was like the most exciting thing ever. I was 13 at the time. And I sort of felt about Pullman like Lyra feels about Mrs. Coulter at the beginning of the novel. Although luckily there wasn't a point where I realized that Philip Pullman was pure evil like Lyra does in the chapter we're going to discuss. But yeah, we went to the venue, which was the the Natural History Museum, where Lyra visits in the Subtle Knife, where she looks at the Trepan skulls, or rather she goes into the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is part of the Natural History Museum in Oxford. And it was a lovely, intimate room. It was about 100 people, and we arrived early. We got there really early on and got to sit near the front. And then Philip Pullman came in, and I remember thinking, I really want to make a good impression because maybe he'll write about me. Maybe I'll become a character in his next book. Maybe he'll be inspired by my appearance or something like that, and I'll be the new Will Parry or whatever. Yeah. And they started talking, and he said, "Yes, I went to the zoo and I saw a family of gibbons, and the mummy gibbon was eating the baby gibbon. And I thought this was a very profound situation." And I just remember thinking, like, what the hell is he on about? And something in that moment made me chortle. And then I started to think, I can't laugh. Because if I laugh, I'll get kicked out. And then I'll never appear as a character in one of his novels. And then I looked up and I was trying my hardest not to laugh. And Philip Pullman was glaring at me. And he used to be a teacher. So he's very good at glaring at unruly 13-year-olds like I was. And somehow I managed to control myself, which was very, very difficult because my friend was sitting next to me. He also got the giggles. We got through the whole talk, thank goodness. And then we queued up to get our book signed. Yeah. And my friend stole the promotional material from the table. He just took all this cardboard cutout stuff of the Amber Spyglass and just gave it to Philip Pullman to sign, who just signed it. So awesome. Kind of that Lyra would have done, I think. And then we wrote to the publisher Scholastic and asked for more material. So they sent us like a nice booklet of the alethiometer and things. So we were really Philip Pullman fan boys. And then I was so excited, to read the Amber Spyglass and loved it. And then, of course, we had to wait approximately 10 million years for the Book of Dust. But it was well worth the wait, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And I read the whole trilogy back when I was 13 or 14, and then I reread them when I was doing my PhD at Oxford, and I kind of felt, because I was, in the equivalent of Jordan College, I suppose, in amongst the setting, I thought I'd give them another read, and I was struck by how formative those books had been for me. I read Harry Potter at the same time. In fact, just before, I read the first Harry Potter book in 1998, and then I read each book as it came out. And for a lot of people of my generation, and even younger, the Harry Potter series was the formative experience. They read them as teenagers. They grew up with Harry. But for me, it was Lyra. I wanted to be Lyra. I wanted to be Will. I still do. Reading those books back, I realized how much they helped form my ideals and what I wanted to be, and what I think heroism is, which is kind of funny because as a child, my favorite author was C.S. Lewis, and it still is an author I adore. But C.S. Lewis was the formative author of my childhood, and Philip Pullman was definitely the formative author of my teenagehood.
That's very, very interesting. I have a very similar experience where I read The Hobbit as a kid of 8 or 9, maybe. I read the Narnia books, shortly thereafter, and I loved both of those. And then my dad gave me a copy of The Golden Compass, which is the U.S. title, and I loved it. I loved all of them. And then much later, as I read more of Philip Pullman and his interviews and essays and things, he really disparages Lewis and Tolkien. He's really harsh, and I think might have some points, but by the same token, some of those points can be turned right around and leveled at him, as some of his critics have done, at Pullman, that is. And I spoke about this a little bit with Verlin Flieger in a previous podcast, which I haven't released yet. So I'm interested to see how our conversation develops, because you sound like you're a little more amenable to Pullman, to say the least, than Dr. Flieger is.
Oh, I mean, I absolutely adore Pullman. I love everything he's written. I've read quite a lot of what he's written, and I think actually the best thing he's written is Clockwork. If you've read that.
I have. I've read everything I can get my hands on. I've never found his early novels, which he also is pretty harsh about when he speaks of them. He has one called Galatea and one called The Haunted Storm. Have you read either of those?
I haven't read those. I haven't even heard of those, actually. Because they're not. Another book I quite like by him is The Broken Bridge, and that's 1990. And actually, that's the novels you mentioned aren't mentioned in the other books by Philip Pullman. So he's sort of hidden those away. That's quite interesting.
He's tried pretty hard to bury them, and that might be his craftiness, is what I'm thinking now, is that he's trying to make them sort of forbidden fruit, and making people really, really drive the prices up on those books, possibly. Who knows?
Well, now I want to read them.
Me too. I haven't found them. I've read pretty much everything I can get my hands on. So when the first book of Dust, La Belle Sauvage, came out, he released also a book of essays. Have you had a look at that? Demon Voices. Okay, good.
Demon Voices, yeah.
Because one of the topics that I wanted to talk to you about, we kind of agreed would be a good place to maybe start, would be his statements about realism versus fantasy, which come up quite a bit in articles and interviews. It's one of the points at which he likes to try to distance himself from Tolkien, especially, which he takes to be sort of the banner for fantasy literature, as far as most people use that term and think about that kind of writing. And he wants to align himself more with realism, and he cites people like George Eliot as kind of the great hallmarks of realist writing. And so there's lots of points that he brings this up. There's lots of essays in which it makes an appearance. But maybe just to start initially here, I guess I'd wonder why his writing does seem so much like fantasy if he so strongly wants it to be realism. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I mean, his argument is that he's using realism for an end, a means to an end, and that end is he's using fantasy as
Right.
a means to get to realism. And it's sort of fantasy is just the kind of vessel in which his imagination spilled into. I mean, it's just the form it took for that story. It served the story. I actually believe that slightly less after reading La Belle Sauvage, which
Mhm.
has a very extraordinary magic realism moment in it. But anyway, we could talk about that another time. But certainly Northern Lights or The Golden Compass, okay, it's about talking bears and it's about witches and it's about demons, but actually it's about people.
Yes.
And the bears are people and the witches are people and the characters are real, whatever reality means. He uses the word real in one of his essays in Demon Voices, actually, the writing fantasy realistically, which
Okay.
he gave at the the Sea of Faith conference.
Right.
Apparently, a group of people who believe that God is non-real. It sounds fascinating, actually. But he talks about reality. And I was thinking about this when I was rereading parts of The Golden Compass last night, and I came across a section which I thought was incredibly moving, about the mother of the first boy who gets stolen by the
Bubbles.
goblin.
Yes.
And it's this mother is an alcoholic,
Yes.
and she her son gets snatched, and she thinks that maybe he ran away, and the scene ends with she cried her. In fact, I'm just going to find it because I want to get the
Oh,
actual quotation.
flavor. Yes, it's a very sentimental scene. I remember. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Read it out for us.
But it struck me as particularly powerful because that's actually what the essence of the story is about. That's the narrative focus. It's not about the demons are actually quite incidental in terms of the narrative focus. In fact, it's so nonchalant. The opening of the whole novel, Lyra and her demon moved through the darkening hall.
Right. So intriguing.
And actually, whenever you ask Philip Pullman a question about demons on Twitter or wherever it is, say like, do demons have sex and are demons born with the person and stuff like that? He always replies, "I have no idea."
Right.
Because it's not important for him. It's not the focus. It's not the story. Whereas
This is
Tolkien
very good. Yeah.
would know the answer. He would have worked out the entire genealogy of every character in the book.
Yeah.
I found the quotation. It's incredibly powerful. She knocks, the doors open, they go in, the door is closed. Tony will never come out, at least by that entrance, and he will never see his mother again. She, poor drunken thing, will think he's run away, and when she remembers him, she will think it was her fault and sob her sorry heart out. And wow, we're in chapter 3, and Pullman is going there. This incredible stuff for a children's book, especially. And I actually, it did make me cry last night. And I'd forgotten actually how powerful that was, but it's a great moment that shows that's what Pullman's really writing about, those kind of moments of humanity, of grief, of separation, of tragedy, and it's not actually about the talking bears.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, so I think it's a fair distinction to make, but I think it depends upon a somewhat superficial reading, and I'm imputing this to Pullman now, that he hasn't read Tolkien very charitably, I guess, if he thinks that Tolkien, because Tolkien has thought so deeply about his world and coming up with genealogies and calendars and stuff like that, that Tolkien has somehow not thought so deeply about the loss and the grief and the characters. Because, I mean, that's why I loved Tolkien as a kid too. It wasn't about, the fantasy elements as much as it was, and still more as I got older, as much as it is about the characters and the story and the themes that are in there. I think they're incredibly rich, and so it makes me wonder not so much about Pullman's skill as a writer, but of his what he's doing as a reader there, and why he would say something so harsh. And I think it might apply more to Tolkien's followers than to Tolkien himself. But even so, it's kind of a mean thing to say. It's maybe a polemical and kind of another one of his sort of crafty moves to try to get people to talk about him, right?
He's incredibly crafty. I think he said his demon would be a magpie.
Yeah.
Stealing little things from different people. That's what authors do. Yeah, I mean, he talks in this article about the fat books crowding the fantasy shelves, all with titles like The Doomsword Chronicles, Volume 17, or RuneQuest, or Orcslayer. And I do know those books he's talking about, and they are pretty grim, I have to say, some of them. I mean, some of them are quite good. But yeah, I think he's a bit harsh in Lord of the Rings. I mean, he says some extraordinary things in this article, this talk. Entities... where he says, yes, Lord of the Rings is inventive, but that kind of thing is not hard to make up, actually. Entities of that sort multiply themselves without much effort from the writer, because a lot of the details are purely arbitrary. I don't think they are arbitrary at all, actually. C.S. Lewis talks about this in an essay on stories. That kind of world building might seem arbitrary at first glance, but it's not. And actually, there was nothing easy or simple about Tolkien's world building, and it is meticulous. And I think there are some pretty deep ideas in Lord of the Rings, but you have to search for them. They're not handed to you. They're not thrust in your face in quite the same way that they are in Pullman. And I'm not saying Pullman is not subtle and nuanced, because he is.
Right.
But I think it's a case of narrative focus. And what the narrator is interested in. And Pullman has some very specific ideas about the narrator, and he treats the narrator as a character. Some kind of mercurial character who has no gender and is non-biased, but it definitely is a character, and you do get that sense in the Golden Compass as well, with some of the comments that the narrator comes out with. Finally, there were other kinds of lessons so gently and subtly given that they didn't feel like lessons at all. Well, whose opinion is that? He's not inside Lyra's mind at that point. It's the narrator has an opinion on some of the events.
One other example of that that appears in chapter 3 is about, he says the librarian was quite wrong. Lyra would have really liked to learn about dust, and she would one day know more about it than anyone in the world, right? So yeah, he makes these little injections of his or her, right, the narrator, the spirit, sort of puts that perspective in there for you to sort of wonder about, but you can easily read right over it the first time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Tolkien also has a narrator character. I mean, Lord of the Rings is supposed to be, isn't it? Well, Sam or something. I can't remember. I mean, the Hobbit is Bilbo, obviously, but it's supposed to be narrated.
Effort between the hobbits in some way. Yeah.
And so I think that the issue is that the narrator has slightly different things they're interested in, and Pullman, I think, is a bit harsh when he calls Lord of the Rings trivial. Yes. I don't know. But we can't all like the same things. And I love Tolkien and I love C.S. Lewis, but I particularly love Philip Pullman because he speaks to me in a way that, as much as I like Lewis and Tolkien, and as much as I think they're worthy of study and reading, they don't quite hit me in quite the same way.
Is it partly? What do you think accounts for that? Because I feel much the same, and actually, for me, it has a little more of it in the Golden Compass, and a little less in the Subtle Knife, and a little less in the Amber Spyglass. I don't know if it was just something about the Golden Compass or about me when I read it, or what do you think that is? Do you feel the same way about the 3 books, or?
I don't quite feel the same way about the 3 books, but I know what you mean, and I have heard other people say something similar. The Golden Compass gets pretty epic. I mean, the tagline for the 3rd book is "War in Heaven. It's up to Lyra and Will now. The fate of the world lies in the balance," or something like that. The tagline for Northern Lights is something like, Lyra's going on an adventure. So it's much more intimate, and it's much more, focused on Lyra growing up, I suppose. And it's an intimate and personal adventure. So perhaps that's something to do with it. I like the epic and I like the intimate, and I think Pullman blends the two together. And actually, there's quite a lot of intimacy in the Amber Spyglass as well. I mean, the real finale
Oh yeah.
isn't about angels versus demons or angels versus angels or God versus man. It takes place under a tree, and it's an intimate moment that is so intimate that we're not quite privy to it.
Yeah.
So I think Pullman pulls it off.
Oh, I
No pun
definitely,
intended.
I still love the books. Like I, especially as a kid, loved them no less. It's only, I think, as I've reread them more and started to think more about the amazing success, the amazing thing that the Golden Compass, the Northern Lights, the first book is. Only in comparison to that do the others. And I think it might have something to do with this quality of self-consciousness. This is kind of a theory that I'm working on, that Pullman becomes more sort of self-conscious of what he's doing as he goes along in the trilogy, the original trilogy. And I don't know how this is going to really develop in the new Book of Dust that he's starting to release now. So far, I really love that one too. I think he's just a master storyteller is what it comes down to. But I think he becomes a little more sort of pushy in a Lewis-esque kind of way as he goes on in the story. He really undermines in some respects the power of the story to just kind of pull you in. And there are moments in the Amber Spyglass that just shatter you because they're so great. But on the whole, on balance, it's not as perfect a story as the Golden Compass, to me at least. And I don't want to quibble too much about this, but I think that is there. That's something that gets noticed, and I'm really interested in what you think about that idea that he's getting more self-conscious as he writes, or something like this.
Well, I mean, he's quite a self-conscious writer. Anyway, I mean, some of his earlier books as well. He gets it quite preachy. I forget what the book was, but it was something whole kind of rant about bicycles in one of his books, and actually La Belle Sauvage has quite a lot about woodwork in it. And
yes,
surprise, surprise, Philip Pullman is a keen woodworker in his spare time, and so he there's a sense that he quite likes sharing his ideas, and in fact, I mean, Demon Voices is full of speeches that he's given. I went to a talk by him at the University Church. In fact, he was asked to give a sermon, and he said, "Well, yes, I don't believe in God, but yes, I'll give a sermon." Likes to communicate, but no bad thing necessarily. It's interesting that he mentions George Eliot, because there's a fantastic part of Adam Bede where there's a chapter called "In Which the Story Pauses," and she says some amazing things that I think really inspired Pullman. She says, "Falsehood is so easy, truth so difficult," and she says that the job of the author is to hold up a mirror to life, to talk about it and represent it as accurately as possible. The pencil is conscious of a delightful facility in drawing a griffin. The longer the claws and the larger the wings, the better. But that marvelous facility, which we mistook for genius, is apt to forsake us when we want to draw a real unexaggerated lion. And for her, the real unexaggerated lion is the better thing. And she continues, "I turn with that shrinking from cloud-born angels, from prophets, sibyls, and heroic warriors, to an old woman bending over her flower pot or eating her solitary dinner, while the noonday light, softened perhaps by a screen of leaves, falls on her mob cap." And that speaks quite strongly to the scene I was talking about earlier, where it comes down to this mother who's very unwell, and she's crying her eyes out because she thought that she drove her son away. It's not about the dragons. It's not about the angels and the witches. It's about that.
Yeah, and that
he's very self-conscious doing it.
That drives the story from the beginning. The loss of innocence and what we do about that, right? So that's not for Pullman necessarily a bad thing. There's bad instantiations and manifestations of that. Like the gobblers, right, are a pretty bad one. And there's all sorts of ways that it can go terribly wrong. People suffer a lot in the books. for reasons that they could have prevented, perhaps, if they'd known more. But on the whole, it seems to be very important that every person goes through that for themselves, right? That's like an experiential kind of learning that takes place as you grow up, as you pursue your personal, right, like represented by your demon, the things you're personally interested in and that grab your attention. And I think that with the example there, the way that the mother has lost her child, I think she's a really interesting parallel for Mrs. Coulter herself, actually. I wonder what you think about the character of Mrs. Coulter as she's introduced here early in the story, and what her relationship with Lyra seems to be like. She's one of the most interesting characters to me.
Well, I mean, it's completely, you read it in a completely different way if you reread it. One of the things I like about Pullman is that he really deserves to be reread.
Oh, yeah.
And actually, rereading this part of the Golden Compass, in fact, this chapter, the cocktail party, you get a reference to the old nunnery at Godstow.
You do, yeah.
Which is quite extraordinary, because it means that the nunnery where Lyra was as a baby in La Belle Sauvage is no longer there. Perhaps it got washed away. I was there instantly last weekend. I went to the Trout Inn, which is a real place. It's
a real place.
Works.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, it's a real place, and I'm sure that Philip Pullman got some special deal, lunches for life, because he makes such a big deal of it in La Belle Sauvage and goes on about how wonderful the food is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a lovely inn by the river, and then you cross a bridge and you get to the Godstow convent, the nunnery, which in our universe is a ruin. It's quite a beautiful old ruin, but in Lyra's universe was still a nunnery, at least until she was a baby, and seems to be abandoned by the time of the Golden Compass. So that's great. It's a great thing to sort of reread and notice. And then, of course, Mrs. Coulter's character changes quite dramatically.
Yes.
Not just because she's a bit evil, although she is, there are sides to her character. In fact, I think there's a bit in George Eliot as well where she talks about holding something up to the light. This is what a novelist does. They take a character and it's like holding up a crystal to the light and turning it and seeing different flashes and different sides of it and so on. And that's something that Pullman does much more than, say, Lewis and Tolkien. And he certainly does that with Mrs. Coulter. But particularly when thinking about this chapter, the cocktail party, knowing, and by the way, final warning, if you haven't read these books, you might want to skip ahead the podcast this bit, because it is a plot point that Mrs. Coulter is Lyra's mother.
Dun, dun, dun. Yeah.
And there's a lot of kind of references to this. A lot of people assume that the Coulter is her mother, and she does a kind of like motherly thing to an extent as well. She's like teaching her how to do stuff. And there's a kind of, goes back to that consciousness you were talking about. There's quite a conscious writing against C.S. Lewis here. So how to, Mrs. Coulter is teaching her lessons, how to wash out one's own hair, how to judge which colour suited one, how to say no in such a charming way that no offence was given, how to put on lipstick, powder, scent. And famously, Susan isn't in heaven by the end of the Narnia series. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. She's not in heaven, and she's more interested in lipsticks and nylon. And I think Lewis is actually really using that as a kind of, to talk about materialism rather than femininity, but it is very problematic that the one kind of time that you're talking about lipstick and nylon and so on is when a character seems immoral. It's as if Lewis is saying, well, being feminine is bad, or growing up is bad, or something like that. And Pullman's going nonsense. It's like Lyra's allowed to grow up.
Exactly.
Growing up does not need to do this terrible thing, this terrible loss of innocence. It's okay if you want to look pretty. It's okay if you want to run around and get your knees dirty. Stop kind of shaming people. And then that's like a lovely little moment when he's taking Lewis to task.
Yeah, people talk about that as the problem of Susan. It's like a
Right.
thing, right, in Lewis studies, and I think Pullman really uh, dramatically, yeah, reverses it here,
Mhm.
and it must be conscious, and and I think uh, to just like turn it around a little bit though, um, when Lyra is with Mrs. Coulter, she is a little bit guilty about her luxurious life. And she's especially guilty, she feels especially guilty, that is, about not remembering Roger enough, right? Her
Yeah.
friend who's just been lost to the gobblers. And that all comes to a head in the cocktail party chapter, where she realizes, overhearing some things that are said and sort of skillfully speaking with Lord Boreal, she sort of learns that Mrs. Coulter is behind Roger's disappearance. So
Mhm.
so she's, you know, innocently been led down this path where she could have been collaborating with the gobblers if she wasn't if she wasn't Lyra, right? If she didn't figure out what was going on in time. Um, but she's
Yeah.
not, she's not without a certain amount of guilt as well. It's couched very, very differently from, wearing lipstick and caring about
Yeah.
nylon guilt.
Exactly. If you're going to feel guilty about abandoning your friends, not about
Yes.
putting on a dress or whatever. That those are those are the things that matter, and I agree with that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, this is an important chapter. It's there's a lot of exposition as well, which Pullman gives through dialogue, and he also he does the kind of oh, what's that famous example of people sitting around in a dinner table and it's very boring, but if you put a ticking bomb underneath, then it becomes very exciting. I forget what that's called. It's a narrative uh, tool, but he does sort of the equivalent of that twice actually so far in the novel. Once when you have Lyra hiding in the wardrobe.
Yeah,
Um, I don't know if that's a reference to C.S. Lewis or not,
I
but,
think
but,
so
but
too.
she's hiding in the wardrobe and listening to Lord Asriel, and then here she's overhearing people at the party, and because she might be discovered in the wardrobe at any moment, then that's a bit more exciting. And in the party, she's already taken against Mrs. Coulter, and she's realized that she smells metallic as if she's a robot or something. Mrs. Coulter has had a go at her, and she's got that first moment of like, maybe she's not as perfect anymore, and maybe I'll get in trouble again. Maybe I'm going to be a bit rebellious. So we have that kind of edge to all this exposition, and she's overhearing this stuff, and all this important information is being conveyed without it feeling like an information dump,
Yeah,
like it does kind of in the Council of Elrond, for example,
for example, yeah,
just
just
to
to
take
throw it out there.
Tolkien again. But the other really interesting thing in this chapter as well is that I think this is the real end of the first act.
Mm.
Um, and I think we've had a false end of the first act. And Pullman is quite keen on structure, particularly something like La Belle Sauvage, where you can really see the acts
Oh,
working. But if you think about the first act ending when the main character makes an important decision and goes through a doorway that they can't get back from, well, this is that moment. You think it's that moment when she decides to go with Mrs. Coulter, but actually that's not really a decision in her hands.
mhm.
The master asks her and she agrees, and then the master says he couldn't have avoided it anyway.
Yeah,
So there's a sense of inevitability there. But the time that she decides to leave Mrs. Coulter and go on the run, well, that's entirely Lyra. And in there's a sense of inevitability about it because she surely she couldn't stay knowing that Mrs. Coulter was part of this. But actually, it's a really impractical thing to decide. It's really difficult. It
yeah,
means that her life is going to be so much more difficult. So, from a narrative point of view, this is the point where Lyra has demonstrated agency and is changing the plot, and has made an important moral decision. It's not just a kind of decision to go along with something. And again, I mean, if we want to compare it to Lord of the Rings, Frodo leaving the Shire feels like that moment, but actually he's really asked, he's pushed along.
Yes.
to leave the Shire, and the Black Riders are coming, so he kind of has to, and he's a bit slow about it anyway, and he decides to go to Rivendell. But the real end of Act 1 in the Fellowship of the Ring is when Frodo says, "I will take the ring." And he makes that decision. He doesn't need to do that. He could have stayed in Rivendell in a way that he couldn't really have stayed in the Shire. But he decides to do that. And Lyra decides to run away from Mrs. Coulter in a way that, in a decision that is different from deciding to go along with Mrs. Coulter away from Jordan College.
Yeah. How do you feel the alethiometer plays into that too? Because it's also in this chapter that they're pretty sure that the Golden Monkey has found the alethiometer and the secret is out, right? So that's part of it too, maybe.
Yeah, the alethiometer is funny because she's given it with really no explanation at all. And again, talking about the rereading aspect of this, knowing that the alethiometer is so precious, and also a bit of the history of it from La Belle Sauvage,
right.
It's incredible that the master just thrusts it in her hands.
Yeah.
I mean, it reminded of, there's an episode of Seinfeld when George Costanza is offered a job, and his boss says, "You are aware," and then he just stops talking and gets distracted by something else. It's like that with the master. It's like, "I'm giving you this thing. You are aware. Oh, yes, you better go. There's someone at the door." I mean, this is like so much more important than this incredibly important thing I'm giving you and telling you about. You would have thought, like, at least give her the instruction manual, just like, or something, just write it down. Like, what is this? But she has this intimate connection with this alethiometer. It's actually quite nice from the cover. I don't know if you can see that. She's really loving the alethiometer there.
Oh, yeah.
And she's had a bit of time with it in bed, just looking at it, and it clearly it's had some. It's called out to her, or the dust has called out to her, or something, in a way that we don't really understand well ever, but we understand a bit of it in The Sudden Life and The Amber Spyglass when she talks to various experts.
Right. Yeah. The way that it starts out is just as this thing that she has to keep secret, right? That's like the clearest thing about the master's injunction to her on giving it to her. There's also this tidbit that it's related somehow to Lord Asriel, right?
Yeah.
You get the second half of that statement because that's when he gets interrupted and says goodbye. You better go. But the secrecy of it, that in that respect, it's very similar to The Ring. Actually, it's something that must be concealed. It's very powerful, but we don't fully understand it. And it's golden, it's round and golden.
So that's true. Well, and in fact, actually, New Line in the first trailer for the Golden Compass film started off with an image of the One Ring that then span in space and turned into the alethiometers. They made it as obvious as you can get. And actually, their filming of this scene was pretty painfully obvious as well. They got rid of the exposition through dialogue, because who needs that in a visual medium like film? And they just had Lyra finding and looking through some documents and reading. This is the most appalling thing I've ever seen in my life. And then she literally says, "Oh, they're the goblins. Oh no. Oh, that means, oh, Mrs. Coulter's evil. Oh, I better leave." And it's like, how could you have made it worse than the book, when surely the book does it in a kind of cinematic way? Why would you make it less cinematic in the cinematic version? Anyway, that's another topic. But yeah, to go back to the alethiometer, it is really interesting because at this point, Lyra is enamored with Mrs. Coulter, loves Mrs. Coulter. Lord Asriel is basically like scary and doesn't seem very nice. The master tried to kill him, so she's not quite sure about the master either. And yet she trusts the master, and she sort of is protecting Lord Asriel against Mrs. Coulter, who's the nice one. So even though on one level it's very simple, Asriel's scary, the master's a would-be murderer, Mrs. Coulter's lovely, there's another layer of complexity here, which is that she has some affection for both the master and Asriel, despite their faults. And although Mrs. Coulter's lovely, she doesn't quite trust her yet. And
Right.
so that, that idea of like complexities underneath simplicity is very appropriate for the alethiometer, because that's exactly what that's about.
Yeah, yeah. So it's sort of it's a series of images, which each of which is a symbol that has multiple layers of meaning, right? Um,
Yeah.
she learns herself how to read it. To me, the alethiometer is a kind of um, metaphor, I guess, or not sure what to call it, but it's sort of like learning how to interpret experience as well, right? It's like you can interpret things on a surface level, you can
Mm.
interpret them with respect to certain books of learning, right? And say this symbol means this or that, right? Or you can sort of like Lyra have questions which you explore and which are answered imagistically. And I think that's kind of what a storyteller does as well. And I think it's really fascinating how um, everything in this book begins as a very mysterious, alluring thing, and then is like filled in with shades of moral and intellectual depth as we go along in the story. But we never lose sight. It's just the most amazing book because we never lose sight of Lyra and Pantalaimon as the heart of this story, right? And they just um, pull you through all of this intellectual, moral, theological stuff, which sort of like rains down, but you never lose sight of them. And then when Will comes in, of him too, and I think it's just the greatest. I mean, deep down, I think I like it more than Tolkien and Lewis, and I really want to understand why. It's very hard.
Yeah, I don't know if I could answer why. I mean, I think their virtues are different, and they work. The reason they're good, there are different reasons why they're good. But yeah, I agree with you about that kind of link between storytelling and the alethiometer, and in fact, indeed, reading and the alethiometer as well.
Yeah.
Reminds me of Paradise Lost, actually, and so Philip Pullman wrote a preface to Paradise Lost. And C.S. Lewis wrote a preface to Paradise Lost, and they're quite interesting to compare.
Oh, wow.
Because, I mean, Philip Pullman's preface is about sort of 5 pages long or something like that. And then he says, one of the things he says is, you've got to read this aloud. You've got to experience this. Just listen to the language of it. Enjoy it. Well, C.S. Lewis's preface is a book in itself, and it's about, I don't know, 50, 100 pages, something like that.
Oh, my.
And I was having a look at it earlier today just to remind myself, because I was just thinking about it. And C.S. Lewis spends time wondering whether the angels in Paradise Lost are gay. And he's
wow.
it was his job. He was an academic, but he goes through in extreme detail and picks out parts of Paradise Lost, does it brilliantly and steadily, and it's good in a different way.
Yeah.
And it is a great work of scholarship. But it does remind me of the 2 ways of reading the alethiometer, because you can do it the Lyra way, where you just sort of empty your mind and experience it, or you can do it the way that the scholars do it, which is with the massive manual and the tome, and you learn to read. And actually, this is how Lyra has to learn to read the alethiometer by the end of the series. And you get the same answers. One is much faster than the other, but I think they're both good in different ways. It's going to be interesting to see if that comes back in the second Book of Dust book, which will have, I think, Lyra as an undergraduate. It should be quite cool to see, and whether we'll see her reading the alethiometer in the very different way, in the kind of, if you like, the C.S. Lewis approach to Paradise Lost way, rather than the Philip Pullman approach that she got to use earlier.
Yeah, that's it. It becomes in that way a kind of symbol for that transition, right, from Lyra as a child to Lyra as adolescent. In the same way that the demon being able to change and then the demon being settled mirrors that process. And I think, it's such an interesting book to read as a kid and then to read as a grown-up. And I think that might also account for part of Pullman's harshness. I don't know for sure, but I think he says somewhere that he didn't read the Narnia books until he was older. Or
that would be interesting if that were true. Yeah.
And I think that's, it's fair to like read critically versus reading charitably is a word that I want to use, like being like taken in by the story versus standing back from the story and sort of, picking it apart, analyzing it. They are very
Yeah.
different. And they both have
Yeah.
their.
And you get that contrast between the scholars of Jordan College and Mrs. Coulter. So they're both teaching her things. And this is discussed in that chapter, The Cocktail Party, where Lyra knows things about atoms, but she doesn't know. There's a wonderful meta joke, actually. She doesn't know about the solar system.
Yeah.
And when Mrs. Coulter explains that the 5 planets revolve around the sun, Lyra laughs. And of course, we're laughing as well because we know it's more than 5 planets.
Right.
Lyra's laughing because she's amazed that planets revolve around the sun. But actually, there's a kind of wisdom in that, because she's laughing from out of ignorance, but actually she has the last laugh, if you like, from the reader's perspective, in that Mrs. Coulter's ignorant in a different way. She thinks she knows, but actually she doesn't, because there's more than 5 planets, unless that the other universe is so different. And so that kind of, the kind of the knowledge of the scholars, where they think they know everything in Jordan College, but actually miss out some very basic stuff. And then Mrs. Coulter teaches her, how to put on makeup and sort of social graces and things like that, which is kind of more practical knowledge. It's kind of like experience versus intellectual spiraling or something like that. But that joke about the planets is quite a good example of how Mrs. Coulter kind of gets those things mixed up as well, and that actually sometimes the more you know, the less you know.
Yeah, and I worry about this a lot as someone trying to talk about the book. I don't want to put it, because
we could be doing the same thing, couldn't we?
Exactly. Yeah. I don't want to do that, but and I think Pullman, he walks that line very carefully when he speaks about his own writing as well. He always says, well, it's the reader and the book, between them the meaning comes out. It's not for me to say authoritatively what the book is about or what dust is or anything. And there's a lot of truth to that, but I think part of that, like the deeper truth you're pointing to, is like we deeply do not know what reality is, right? Mm-hmm. We approach it in various ways, and we put different, isms on those approaches. We can call it fantasy, we can call it realism, but there's something deeply mysterious there, and that's what sort of pulls us into the story, right? Dust is another great metaphor for that. It's like, it's that thing which draws your attention, which seems enticing and dangerous, and there's that smell of glamour about Mrs. Coulter too, right? Grown-upness, right? Innocence is led into experience by this kind of temptation. Like that's the fall, right? And how you then go back and interpret that is open, right? There's a canonical interpretation of that, and then there's one that's Gnostic, and Pullman sort of plays with both of them and weaves them together into this story, which is like its own thing entirely, and I think begets further interpretations. And I just really like, how Lyra from the very start is entranced by dust, right? Knowing nothing else about it except that it's very, it's sort of beautiful. It's mysterious. It has a capital letter. Like, what's that about? And I think that is, I hope that sort of wonder is impervious ultimately to any attempts to explain. That's sort of like always is going to be there.
And it's irony of ironies. It's a very C.S. Lewis idea. He talks about almost exactly the same thing in Surprised by Joy, except he talks about northernness with the capital N, and the line "Balder the Beautiful is dead," not knowing what that meant and not needing to know, but just sums up kind of ideas of the North. And the North is a huge draw for Lewis, and of course a huge draw for Philip Pullman as well. And part of the charm and draw of this novel is the lure of the North. And I mean, I want to go to Svalbard.
Yeah.
I want to see the icy tundra and and so on. And just because there's something like you said, you can't fully explain it. It's more than the sum of its parts, and I think it's something that C.S. Lewis strongly felt, not just with the North, but with lots of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Philip Pullman strongly feels it as well. I think they're two sides of the same coin, actually. But Tolkien, just to go back to that idea of mystery, I'm not sure there is that much mystery in Lord of the Rings. There's a kind of, things are quite explained. There's a few edges of the map, and actually Tolkien did talk about this, that you should have the kind of the glint of towers and poking through the mist, that kind of mysteriousness of things that you won't get to understand. But there's still a feeling that you could understand that if you only you had enough volumes of Christopher Tolkien's complete works or whatever, or that something will come out that will explain it. That there is an answer there. It's just that you need to go over there. You need to research that. Whereas I think what Philip Pullman is talking about, and actually C.S. Lewis as well, is that kind of it's difficult to explain. It's almost religious. It's almost spiritual. It's like, why is something beautiful? Why is something sublime? It's just something that makes you, that the pull of the north, of the wonder of the northern lights, tugs at your soul in some way. So I think that maybe that's one of the reasons why I love this novel. But I couldn't explain why, and perhaps it would be a mistake to try and dissect that too much, as the gobblers do.
Exactly.
The link between the demons and the children.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk before we wrap up about video games a little bit, since you said you're interested in video.
I love video games. Yeah, I play a lot of video games.
Part of my approach in this project is thinking about obviously the film was kind of a flop, but how could this book look as a video game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like imagining an adaptation to that medium. And I wonder if you've had thoughts about that, like if you have games that you've played that you think this is a way in which that story could be adapted successfully. It could look something like this or that. Have you thought about that?
Yes, I've got thoughts. I mean, there was a Golden Compass video game based on the film that I haven't played. Wikipedia. It had pretty poor reviews, and it looks pretty awful. Well, I'm going to shock you slightly in that I'm still thinking about this, but I would say that I don't want any video game to do with his Dark Materials, and I love video games, and I think that as a narrative form they can be incredibly fine. And there are some video games such as Jordan Mechner's The Last Express, which reach the same level as the best novels, and that's high praise. But I don't really want his Dark Materials video game, because I think that the novels work so well, and the appealing things about the novels can only really be captured in novels, possibly TV and film. So we'll see how the BBC do with their new series. And Pullman talked about this actually. He talked about the narrative again. You can't really capture the narrator in a film unless you're very, you can do, maybe the best director can do subtle things in the background and so on. And actually, there are moments in the Golden Compass film where they do something like that. When Lyra's walking over the tables at the beginning of the film, and dust is caught in sunbeams.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's, it's a little bit of nuance, a little bit of foreshadowing perhaps, and that kind of thing, which novels do so effortlessly. Films can do. I'm not sure video games can do quite that same thing, and I don't think they can capture quite the quality of Pullman's work. But I was thinking of one video game when thinking about Pullman's comments on the narrator and the narrator as a character.
Okay.
And that video game is Half-Life 2, which is extraordinary narrative because there's a huge amount of exposition. There's a huge amount of data to give to the player about this world and about what's happening. And the main character is mute. He never says anything. And you never get that in a novel. Because even if the character didn't speak, you would hear the character's thoughts, and you don't get that in Half-Life 2. You might get it in a film, but Well, I mean, I was thinking of Duncan Jones's film Mute, in which the main character is mute, but he still writes things down. And you see the expressions on his face. You don't get anything like that in Half-Life 2 because it's first-person perspective. You get absolutely nothing from that character you play, Gordon Freeman. And actually what you get instead is that the character you play is really the narrator. And the main character in that story is really Alex Vance. And I think that's quite interesting. And that's something that video games can do that books and television and film can't do. And so when thinking about video games as narratives, I think let video games be video games. Get them to do the things they can do particularly well that novels can't do. Let novels do the things they can do particularly well that video games can't do. And I think Pullman is in the right medium. He's a novelist, but he's a playwright as well. But I'm not sure that his work would be adapted to the medium of video games.
I see a lot of the difference between narrator voice, and it's the way that the reader interacts with that and how that sort of conveys the story and tells you the story versus the way that you, as the player of the video game, you controlling a character, you sort of guide them through a world, right? Mm-hmm. And so I see how those are very different. But I think I'm interested in the possibilities of sort of exploring a world in a way that's like opened up by the story that the narrator tells, which in itself is there, right? It's not like you're undoing that world by taking things from it and creating another story. And essentially, every time you play the game, you'd be making up another story, right? Within the sort of the rules and the principles that are like there for you.
Right, and that can happen. I think The Last Express, which I mentioned before, which is set on the Orient Express on the eve of World War One, is like that. It's slightly different every time you play it, and I find different things every time I play it. Pandora's joining in. I don't know if you can hear. She's got lots of opinions about video games. But I don't know. I mean, the other thing that I was thinking of when you were talking about open world, well, what's it called? Red Dead Redemption? Is that what it's called? Red Dead Redemption?
I think so.
Something like that. It sounded ridiculous when I said it aloud. I'm so used to reading it. I haven't played it yet. But anyway, that looks interesting. And the new Spider-Man game as well looks quite interesting as storytelling in an open world setting. We've had that with the Elder Scrolls games as well, but actually the storytelling feels a bit disconnected. Whereas it looks like Red Dead Redemption and the Spider-Man game are building up an overstory through an open world. And again, that's something that novels and film can't do. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out as a new narrative tool, a new way of telling stories.
Yeah. I feel like I'm not sure that this video game will ever actually happen. And so it's very much just kind of like a thought experiment and a way to kind of explore the story in a new way. But if it does someday happen, I hope really strongly that it, like Pullman sort of leads you into other great writers, I hope that the video game would be kind of a gateway back to the story itself, like the one that Pullman tells. That's sort of my overarching goal, really, is to like entice people to read these stories again, whether it be The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, Pullman's books, Lewis's books.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. It makes me a bit uncomfortable though, because I feel like you shouldn't need to be enticed by anything other than the joy of reading. But people do need to be enticed, let's be honest. So I don't know. I mean, there's a whole other debate there, which is about kind of art versus public pleasing and so on. And I don't know. That's a whole other debate. But I'm slightly concerned sometimes about how the novel might be made secondary, particularly to film, and how like the purpose of writing a novel is really to get a film deal, and sort of the novel is a stepping stone to the Hollywood deal, and I hope that doesn't happen with video games. That's kind of like you write a novel in order to get a video game or something like that. But I think we're probably a way off that with video games. I think it's happening to an extent with films, unless the novel is very strong, which it certainly is in the case of Pullman.
So do you write? Do you create video games? What kinds of things do you do creatively?
I did, I did make video games back when I was about the same age as when I was reading Pullman for the first time, actually, when I was about 13, just for fun. These days I write fiction. I'm writing a novel. So I don't know. I'd love to make video games as well, but it's just become so complicated.
Right.
I mean, video games, it's like sending people to the moon or something. You've got to have like 500 people just to do anything. And also it's a very volatile and ruthless industry as well. So I have a lot of respect for people who make video games, but I'm not sure it's quite for me. I'm going to stick to writing novels, I think.
Right on. Well, best of luck with that, and thanks again, Gabriel, for taking the time to talk about Pullman and geek out with me a little bit. And
well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to meet a like-minded person and to talk about some of these issues that I think are really fascinating. And I can't wait to hear how this podcast develops as well. I'll certainly keep track of it and keep track of your video games ideas as well.
Fantastic. Thanks again. We'll let you go.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Pandora's going to say goodbye. Pandora's in a great mood, as you can see. She's loving this. Oh, poor Pandora. I'm sorry. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good night.